Welcome to Rebuild. Here we explore the pillars that hold up the foundation of Christianity and Western civilization. We examine where and how these pillars are crumbling, and we think about what we can do to rebuild them. This is a podcast and an effort for us to understand things that have been thought through before by people who went before us and to learn what they said. Both Bradley and I have been very surprised at how much the problems that we are facing now as society and as the church have actually already been considered by much more intelligent, much more godly men who went before us. And so our goal here is to rebuild, to try and help rebuild some of the things that we have lost in the church and in society at large. Now, we like to say that we are rebuilding one pillar at a time, but I want to start off our episode today, Bradley, by presenting maybe a slightly different analogy, a slightly different way to think about society than kind of a slab set on pillars or pillars holding up a roof. That's a helpful analogy, but I've been thinking about a different analogy that might help lead into our topic of conversation for today, which, by the way, our topic for conversation today is related to the question, what should the church and the government's cooperation look like? Is the church a mouthpiece for the government? At times, always, should the government expect the church to help out with its causes, social programs, things like that? So those are the questions that we're going to be exploring today. But before we do, I want to present this other analogy, Bradley. And so this will be a little bit new. It's new in my thinking, and I really am interested in your thoughts on this, Bradley. So here we go. The society, we could say, instead of pillars, which is a good analogy, we could say society is like a woven piece of cloth. Okay, that is hanging in a frame, and the frame has four borders around it, wooden borders around it. And the threads, they can run up and down or back and forth, and I even think diagonally, right? They're attached to pieces of the frame, and they're running across or diagonally across the frame and attaching to a piece that's on the other side from it, okay? So the fabric is formed as the threads cross each other and interweave. But that only works if the threads connect from one wall to another. So the borders have to be there to stretch the threads tight. Without those borders, you simply have a pile of tangled thread, like a knotted up ball of yarn that is not useful in any way. If you ever try to untangle thread or yarn, or even like a necklace that gets all tangled up or something like that, it's a complete worthless thing. Right? You might as well just throw that thread away. It's totally worthless. Okay, so the borders of the frame, and in the analogy of society, they define the shape. They allow for the fabric to exist, not just the ball of string. And the fabric can be woven in many different patterns, many different colors, different thicknesses, different coarseness and fineness of texture. But without those borders, there is only chaos. Okay? So as we have said before, and in fact, last episode, we talked about this, God wants humans to create culture. Right? He wants humans to exercise dominion over the earth. He wants us to participate in kind of bringing forth the potential and offering that potential back to God as an act of worship. But our attempts, because of the fall, because of the curse, they have a tendency, because of our fallen natures, to cause harm and damage to ourselves, maybe even the environment. Okay? So we have these borders that are kind of like a fence around the playground. They keep us safe. They structure our activity. The fence around the playground actually allows children to play in a way that feels safe. Okay? So these four borders that I've been talking about are the four restraining forces that God has given to us that restrain the evil or the tendency towards ruin that is built into us now since the fall. Okay, these four forces are these. Now, one border is the self-discipline of the individual. Okay, and here I mean the individual conscience. Okay, the sense of right and wrong that God has put into every person, but also the desire and the capacity to hold ourselves back from vice in order to achieve virtue. Now, obviously, this is not a perfect process, and we are slaves to sin apart from Christ. And yet, even so, there's a sense where we can build society that discourages vice and encourages virtue on an individual level. So that's one piece. That's one of the borders. Okay. Another one is the family and the way that it is supposed to train children out of folly, out of foolishness, out of rebellion, as it educates them on what is right and wrong. Okay, so that's the second one. The government and its task of punishing evil and rewarding what is good is the third border. Now, it's important that we notice that when it's to reward what is good, that's good as God defines it, not as the government defines it. So if the government defines killing babies as good, that's not actually the good that we're talking about. They're supposed to reward what is good as God defines good. And then the fourth border, the fourth wall of this frame is the church, which is supposed to train in righteousness. It's supposed to administer the word of God, instruct individuals, government, and families on what honors God and how to live in a way that honors God. Okay, it's supposed to teach us what we should value. Oftentimes, we go wrong in society by substituting just the general idea of spirituality or religion for the church. Okay, so Bradley, are you with me so far on this?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you're getting into spheres of authority realms, but contextualizing it well as far as borders of a fabric. No, I think it's good.
Okay, good. So the threads, obviously, they connect the four sides to each other, right? And so here's kind of why I think this is a helpful analogy. Society is the fabric. Okay, society is made up when people work within the borders and create this fabric. Okay, if a society, now here's something interesting. If a society has a tendency to only connect threads between one side of the border and the other, the fabric will be very thin and very narrow. It won't be strong. There'll be no cross weaving, and the parts on the side of it are going to fray. There are going to be big holes there. So, for instance, if a society only connects threads between, let's say, the government frame and the family frame, we end up with essentially a society that only has threads connecting those two frames. And this would maybe look like a very anemic piece of fabric because it would just be small tribes. It would be maybe mafia bosses or clans, that sort of thing. And there would be holes where the other two border pieces have very few threads coming off of them to kind of enrich the fabric. Okay? This would leave holes. Okay, and maybe there'd be very little regard or understanding of God's command. There'd be very little appreciation of the individual or the role of the individual in society. Okay, if a society is made of threads that primarily connect individuals to the church, so we're leaving out a connection from government and from family, we might have a very religious, maybe even an extremely individualized society where everyone has his or her own idea of truth and value and right and wrong. In many ways, that is similar to our current society today. The border of the church has been broken, and someone has tried to glue in a replacement of kind of spirituality in its place. And then we've cast a bunch of threads between the weakened border and the individual. Okay, and so this damaged spiritual border has cracked again. It's being pulled up into the middle, so we have fabric, but it's unclear, it's fraying, it's loose, it's not strong. Okay, so why do I bring that up? Well, today we're going to talk about the connections between some of these frames. Okay, and specifically, we want to talk about the threads that are stretched between the two walls of the frame, which are government and the church. Okay, what should those threads look like? What should those threads, what ways should they pull, what ways should they interact with other threads, and how should the fabric look if the threads between the government and the church are properly stretched and mixed in with the rest. So before we kind of dive into a specific case study, any comments on that, Bradley?
No, I think it's clear. I mean, God has arranged the four sides of it. He knows the rules of those sides. Your analogy falls apart a little bit in the sense that I think there are some sides that are stronger than other sides, and more influential in our lives, or should be more influential. The weakest one of them should be the government. But as far as an analogy goes, it works well. I mean, government definitely has a role in structuring society. As Christians, we should honor that role. And like you said, that role is pretty simple when you boil it down to punish wrong and reward good under the confines of what God says is good. And it's up to the other four sides to help influence and explain and counsel what is good. It's up to the individual, the family, and the church to influence that. But they are all interconnected. So I like it. I like where it's going.
Okay. So we're reacting kind of to a media story that was broken by a reporter at the Daily Wire last week, maybe the week before, Megan Basham. And in short, her article pointed out that Francis Collins, who was for many years the director of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins claims to be a Christian. He's in fact written a very famous, well-received book about kind of this cosmic, is God out there from a scientist's point of view, right? And he was the head of the team that discovered the human genome. And so he's kind of been always regarded as this example for Christians of a scientist who is able to maintain his faith and yet have a lot of credibility in the scientific sphere. Now, the story that Megan Basham published pointed out that Francis Collins was able to kind of call on religious leaders, evangelical Christian leaders, I should be more specific, evangelical Christian leaders, big names like Tim Keller and Rick Warren and others, artists and pastors. I guess you'd call them influencers in the Christian world. He was able to call on them to actively promote the vaccine mandates, adopting the vaccine in churches, and really asked them to encourage churches to turn around and then encourage their members to go and get the COVID shot, right? And so I guess the scandal here is twofold. One, this is a government agency who's asking pastors to go back to their congregations, actually asking people who influence pastors to ask the members to participate in this government rollout of the vaccines, right? But secondly, was her research into the positions that Francis Collins has supported and stood for in his tenure as the NIH director. And in short, Francis Collins has supported many positions which frankly are not Christian. He has supported using body parts from aborted babies for research, not just one or two, but a lot. He has supported research, or at least funded research, that allowed for mixing of baby tissue and grafting that onto animals. He has been vocally outspoken as an ally and an advocate of the gay agenda, the homosexual agenda, and she goes on with other things. And her point was, why were evangelicals so vocally in favor of Francis Collins, not just as a scientist, but as a Christian, a man of God, And then why were they so eager and willing and accommodating to his request of convincing their churches and the people in their churches that the vaccine was a safe and effective and good idea for them to take? So that's kind of the story that got us thinking about this whole connection. Should the government have asked pastors to do that? Should the pastors have agreed to go back and do that because of the fact that the government asked them to, right? This wasn't something they arrived to that conclusion on their own, but rather call-ins through various leaders, and then the articles that they would write, the books that they would write, and the interviews that they would have would convince pastors and ministry leaders to then convince their members to go out and get the COVID shot.
Yeah, this is the very, very serious Francis Collins that sung a parody version of Somewhere Over the Rainbow called Somewhere Past the Pandemic as his farewell address from the NIH directorship position. Very, very serious man that we were talking about. And the trouble is, he is one of few Christian scientists, vocally Christian scientists in a position of authority. And Christians have become so desperate to be validated by their views on science, that a scientific, someone espousing to be a Christian in a scientific position is just kind of like we have influential people too, which I think is why, to a small degree, why Christians are easy to go. Oh, this guy's important. This guy must be important. He's important to our cause because he says he's a Christian, but he's also like recognized by the world as a good scientist. But he's a very serious guy.
Yeah. And
if you couldn't detect the hint of sarcasm in my voice there, it's there.
I did detect it. Yeah. So we're going to ask 3 questions here, and we're going to try and answer them. Mainly what we're going to do is we're going to ask the questions, and then we're going to ask questions around those questions. So the first question that we're going to ask here in this episode, based on kind of reacting to this situation with Francis Collins, is what involvement should the government and the church have together, right? Or maybe not what involvement should they have together, but is it ever appropriate for the church to kind of sign up for or follow along in an agenda that the government has decided is a good idea for the church to help with? Okay, so that's the first question. Second, we're going to look at how this kind of more abstract idea, we don't want to stay abstract for too long, but that abstract question, we're going to look at how that played out specifically in the pandemic with the relationship between government and churches. So our second question will be, what was the response to COVID by the church? Was it a good example of collaboration between government and churches, or was it a bad example? In other words, what did the church do in the pandemic, and what should it have done instead? And then our third question will be, what should the church do and change now at this stage of COVID? And we were just kind of joking before this that we seem to be on the tail end of it, and yet I think that we still need to ask the questions: what could the church do now? We're not out of it, and we have some lessons to learn from it.
What is COVID? What is this COVID thing you speak of?
I guess as the pastor of our church says, and I don't know if he came up with it or not, but one thing that we can thank Vladimir Putin for is for curing COVID.
Absolutely. But now we're Putin sympathizers, so
yeah,
shame us.
Yeah, shame us. We'll hear about that, I'm sure. Okay, so our first question here. Should the church work with the government towards quote-unquote good ends? Okay, and that's in air quotes because it has a lot of assumptions in there. Who defines what the program is or what the idea is? who decides if it's a good end or a bad end or a worthwhile end, okay? But as loaded as the question is, that's how we're going to frame it. Is it good for the church to work with government agencies, government programs to promote and accomplish quote-unquote good ends? Okay, and so Bradley, as we did some research on this, we came across an article, which we can link below, talking about a speech that Rick Warren, who's the pastor of Saddleback Church and the best-selling author of a number of books, including The Purpose-Driven Life and its various spin-offs, he gave a speech at the 2008 World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Okay, now this is a collection of the most powerful, influential people from around the world who gather to basically talk about and decide the direction of massive public policies, economic decisions, and they try and steer the direction that governments and corporations will take when it comes to financial policies and even policies outside of financial questions purely. Okay, the money is flowing, and which direction do we want it to flow, and what do we want to accomplish with it? Okay, so Rick Warren, interestingly enough, was invited to speak at the 2008 World Economic Forum, and in this speech that he gave, I'm just going to read a couple of quotes here from him. Okay, he's talking about what can we do to get rid of some of the big problems in the world, and this is what he says. He says these problems. He's talking about maybe poverty or disease or unemployment, things like this. He says these problems are so big that nobody has been able to solve them. The U.S. hasn't solved them. The UN hasn't solved them. Nobody has solved them. And I think it's because it's going to take a three-pronged strategy to do this. There's a role for the public sector, that's the government. There's a role for the private sector, so that's business and corporations. And there's a role for the faith sector. He says there is a role for the public sector, the private sector, and the faith sector. Each of them can do something that none of the other three can do. Government has a role to set agenda. Government has a role to set priorities and things like that and to move nations. And there are some things that only governments can do. Businesses have a role, which they have. They bring expertise, they bring investments, they bring all kinds of innovations to the market. But then also, houses of worship. Now listen to this. Houses of worship have things that businesses and government will never have. In the first place, we have universal distribution. The church was global 200 years before Davos started talking about globalization. You see, there are 600 million Buddhists in the world. There are 800 million Hindus in the world. There are 1 billion Muslims in the world. But there are 2.3 billion Christians in the world. If you take people of faith out of the equation, you've ruled out 5/6 of the world. So we have to mobilize these faith groups to work together on these issues that have been unsolvable. And the church has, of course, the greatest distribution. They also have the biggest manpower with 2.3 billion people. That means the church, the Christian church, is bigger than China. It's bigger than India. In fact, it's bigger than India and China put together. So nothing compares to its size. And then listen to how he concludes this. He says this: we have hundreds of millions of people who volunteer around the world in villages and cities on a weekly basis, and we don't have to pay them. The third thing that they have is that they have local credibility. At the local level, people trust that priest or that pastor, or for that matter, any mom or a rabbi, the religious leader of their faith, because he's marrying, he is burying, he is helping them through the stages of life. When the crisis comes, NGOs come and go, nations come and go, but for instance, the church has a 2,000-year-old track record. So Bradley, as you hear that quote read again, what's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, he conflates a couple of things. But first off, when he says 2.3 billion are being ignored, I mean, those 2.3 billion exist in the private and public sector as well. So his point is well taken on that, but also like he's conflating some things too. But it is a little scary because Davos is a very sketchy, very sketchy place. They have a illusion that they can steer the direction of the world for good, and Rick Warren seems to be falling into this same illusion that he can be a part of this global influential change. Now, the church is called for global change, but it is not called for a global change tethered to a very secular group like Davos that does not have biblical values, does not have biblical foundations, biblical truth undergirding it. The church is an agent of change for the gospel. And part of that gospel witness is what he's talking about, solving things like, or working on things like poverty and disease. But that is not the end-all, be-all that Davos wants to treat it as, because Davos uses that as a mechanism of control, whereas the Christian calling is to use that, and this is where Rick is drastically misled. The Christian calling uses it as a means to an end, as far as like we are afflicted on earth, but Christ is the ultimate way to a perfect relationship and a perfect design that we were created for. And without that, everything falls flat. So it's a little disconcerting to hear him that he was even there. And then, here we are 14 years later from that speech. And we kind of see what the global agenda and what these people actually have in mind and the amount of control that they can possess through things like COVID. So hindsight 2020, it's really alarming. At the time, it should have been alarming. But we weren't quite there. I wasn't quite there. And certainly the church, I don't think, was there either. So.
Yeah, what concerns me here is I hear what you're saying about, part of the mission of Christians or the good works that Christians in the church do is to alleviate suffering. Certainly this is true. And yet he wants to hand over the 2,000-year track record and credibility of the Christian church. He specifically says that. He says people trust their priest, their pastor. He's been there to marry them, to bury them, to bless their babies, etc., etc., etc. He wants to hand that credibility over to an organization like the World Economic Forum, so that together we can finally achieve this goal of eliminating poverty or eliminating disease, right? And the line that really resounded to me in thinking about COVID was, he says this at the end, he says, when the crisis comes, NGOs come and go, nations come and go, but the church has a 2,000-year-old track record. And almost like I don't think he was talking about COVID in any way, but it's almost like the World Economic Forum leaders would have heard that and said, okay, when the crisis comes, we can tap into churches and specifically church leadership to carry out our direction and our mission for however we choose to deal with this crisis. And that to me was the thing that really raised alarm bells, because the church cannot allow its agenda and its mission to be determined by secular organizations, right? We have marching orders from Christ, and we follow him. And maybe our paths run parallel sometimes to what a government is doing or corporations are doing, but we don't do it because they're asking us to, and we don't give our credibility to them. We're pointing people to Christ. We want them to see Christ, not the World Economic Forum.
Yeah, you mentioned how this is similar to marriage, and I think it's really actually, just talking through it again now, it really is a great comparison, because we've given over the institution of marriage to the state, and we've seen that has collapsed the definition of marriage, because now the state defines what is and isn't marriage, and we as Christians go, well, wait a minute, we didn't sign up for this. Like, we still want to view marriage as this, but we didn't establish ourselves as the authority on marriage. Christ has determined, well, God has determined from the beginning of time what good, healthy marriage is. And the church, it is okay for the government to come alongside that. Like you say, we're on a parallel track, but we are the ones that should be instituting what marriage is, not the state. And so comparing it to our relationship with poverty and our relationship with health, public health, the church it's not quite as direct. God designed it for this, but he did give us the biblical principles for how to care for the poor, and to hand that over to any kind of political or government authority and say, you guys take the reins and we'll come alongside you, is a perversion of the design of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It concerns me that the church was willing to partner and willing to say that the decision was for how to deal with these things. I guess we already said this is rightly in the government's hands, right? So I guess what we're saying here is the church, I think, needs to make sure that it is only following one master, and that is Christ. And it's only taking marching orders from one master, and that is from Christ. And so I guess to the question of should the church work with government towards good ends, I think if anything, the church is supposed to inform the government about what is good and true and righteous. It's supposed to inform the family of what is good and worthy of effort, and it's supposed to inform the individual of what is virtue and for what reasons he should be disciplining himself. And certainly the church works to alleviate suffering, but it really does concern me when it is the mouthpiece or the hands and feet, not of Christ, but of the government or government program. And I think we really run into a serious conflict of interest when the church allows itself to simply become the mouthpiece of the government, right? And maybe this is getting into the COVID discussion a little bit. Is the church simply the vocal cords by which the government gets its message out to people of faith in America? Well, that to me is a disaster. It's lacking in discernment. It's lacking in understanding of who we answer to, of why we do the things we do as a church. So I would be very, I'm very suspicious of this idea of the church working hand in hand and following the government agenda for society.
Well, it distorts. You're exactly right. It distorts where true authority comes from. We as Christians know that the authority comes from God's word, but we have relinquished that over to the authority of the state and deferring to what the state views as maybe the better common good, because they have the quote unquote expert class. They are acting in the best quote unquote best interests of the public. But the church has the real authority, and through that authority, they should have a lot more discernment, a lot more suspicion. You can call it holy suspicion, a lot more discretion about where power is being manipulated, and if it is for common good. And the church should not bend a knee to anything under any banner other than the God's word and his calling for us.
Yeah, good. So with that kind of in mind, needing to have a heavy dose of suspicion and really vigilantly guarding our mission, not really our mission, let me retract that, really heavily guarding the idea of who we get our mission from, what will motivate us to action and why, and that mainly being Christ, like you're saying. Let's move into the second question. All right, let's look at this concept in the specific case study of COVID. And let's ask the question, what was the church's response during the pandemic, right? How did it respond? And maybe how do we think it should have responded differently? So anything you want to say about this second question now?
A lot. Where do I stop? First, I'm gonna lead off. We're all at the COVID fatigue. At this point, in March of 2022, we've all well hit that COVID fatigue, and we're not talking about this because we want to rehash. We want to do the play-by-play analysis after the fact. Monday morning quarterback it. We are just now getting to a point where we have been convinced and convicted enough that we should be speaking truth where we see it. And COVID has been a big part of that. COVID has brought us to that point. Me certainly, and I think Michael's in that same boat. So we're talking about it maybe a little late, but only because our conversations with each other over the past 2 years have led us to a point of conviction that we need to be talking about it now. And I've had concerns. I've had lots of concerns within my church, specifically as to how they handled the COVID response. And for me, first and foremost, it was the messaging of deference to the government's authority in leadership, and a distorted perspective of what love is. Love for the neighbor, love for your, it was put the mask on because that's loving. And to me, from the very beginning, that was distortion of what love is. So that was one of the things that I saw in the church's response. Well, I guess two, the deference and then the definition of love. That was really concerning to me.
Okay, so let's track this here. So our question this is question 2, part A. How did the church respond to COVID, to the pandemic? And you're saying one way that they responded was they deferred to what the government was telling them, not only to do, but also what should be the appropriate response and even feeling about it. I'm including kind of what the media was saying about it too. And then the second thing that you're saying is
to the metrics in which we use to measure what was going on. So they deferred to what should be the response, but they also deferred to what the metrics, what the case numbers were. And I don't want to diminish anything of what COVID did, but most of us were in a position to go, we look around and based on what they're telling us, we should be seeing a lot more damage, a lot more carnage. And there was certain areas that had carnage, but it didn't match up. It didn't line up. So we were deferring to them with basically no questions asked to what the metrics were for how we were measuring our response, the reasons for our responses.
Good. Yeah. So we deferred to them in spite of, I think you might say, evidence that should have at least caused us to slow down and say, is what they're saying true? Without even assigning any motives necessarily at that point, just is what they're saying valid and legitimate? Okay. Second of all, you're saying one of the things that the church did was I'm kind of going to jump off your answer here and add my twist to it. What it did was it decided to kind of distill the idea of loving your neighbor down into one or two kind of simplistic statements. Loving your neighbor is following what the government says about COVID, whether that is wearing a mask, whether it is not going to your neighbor's house or your family's house for a holiday, whether that is not going to church, social distancing, allowing their businesses to be closed down, vaccinating your children, and supporting mandates that require people to be vaccinated or else lose their jobs. So you're saying that we are saying that the church allowed the definition of loving your neighbor to be only viewed in this very narrow, very new sort of sense at the exclusion of ideas such as speaking truth to your neighbor. Like where was the church when people were freaking out? There was a statistic at one point that most people thought that over 40% of people who contracted COVID were admitted to the hospital with serious cases, right? And that was not, it was like 5%. Okay. Where was the church insisting on true thinking about fatality rates, right? Where is the loving response of speaking truth to one another about these things? No, we can't talk about that. All we can do is define loving your neighbor as what the government says should be your response, right? Nowhere did we say what is loving about allowing the government to close down small businesses and they basically go bankrupt and large corporations continue to succeed. Is that theft? Is that stealing money away from them, essentially? Is it stealing labor away from workers who can no longer? And then is the government taking money from taxes from other people to give to the people that are now in financial difficulty because of the policies that the government put in place? Like where is the loving your neighbor when it comes to theft of wages from businesses to give to people who lost their jobs because of government policies? I think what we're saying is the idea of love that's found in the Bible is based in the last 6 of the 10 Commandments. And we boil down the whole issue of loving your neighbor to one simple issue: mask, vaccine, do what the government says. Isolation.
Yep. Stay far, far away. And it led to, I don't know if led to, it exposed and fostered a culture of fear. And it said that, we as Christians, they didn't directly say this. They would never come out and say this, but their response was very much, we fear death. We fear the toil of life, as opposed to living life abundantly and facing the trials and a lack of recognition that, like, this is a cycle of life that has existed from time in forever. And we live in such a comfortable time now that we think that we can have control over these things and we can influence the outcome of these things. And I think God was pretty clear to say, yeah, it doesn't really matter what you do or how you handle it. This is rolling through the way it's going to roll through. And I don't mean to trivialize anything, but the numbers just, whether states masked up or didn't, whether they isolated and shut down or they didn't, like, the numbers just don't line up. And to me, that's saying we gave ourselves way too much credit for what we can control here on earth, instead of what should have been the response was, like I said, living life abundantly, and acknowledging the reality that we live in a fallen, cursed world. And part of that fall and part of that curse is sickness and plague. And we weep with those who weep, but we don't cower away from that. We don't shut our doors to our churches. We don't move to online services. We don't hide our faces from people out of fear. Like, these are things that the church was not speaking to because we deferred to a common good, love your neighbor, top-down government response.
Yeah, during this time, I heard a couple of people talking about it, and I read it as well, an essay by C.S. Lewis, in which he talked about why is it important to continue to do normal human things when there's a war going on. And basically, the title was something like, why study history or why go to university in a time of war or something like that. And he talked about in times of crisis, humans need to continue to do the things which make them human. And it seems like the church embraced a mentality of, we will give up the things which show love to one another, which show comfort to one another, which show real human relationship as God defines it, right, to one another because of this catastrophe, because of this great danger. And man, like if we're talking about what should the church have done, the church should have challenged us to continue to show the kind of love that God asks us to not cling to safety over neighborliness, over love, over corporate worship together of Him. Like those things are irreplaceable. They can't be replaced with a camera on the top of a laptop. Right? So that's definitely one of the things that the church, in my opinion, just gave up so quickly and so easily. It wasn't that I heard lots of debate or saw lots of resistance to it. It was just like, yeah, this seems reasonable. Yeah, this is absolutely what we should do.
Well, and I think the fact that we live in an age of just an overwhelming amount of information, you are naturally going to get information on both sides. Everyone's going to be polarized into, well, I saw this study or I saw that study, which is a detriment to our society the way we live now. But it is also a reality, and because of that, I think largely churches didn't really know how to handle those disagreements and come to a point of conviction and say, this is the way we as a church are going to move forward. And instead, they said, well, we can't come to any kind of firm biblical agreement here, which I would contend with. They could have, but their deferment then at that point was to, this is what the expert class, the government class is asking us to do. It's not that big of a deal, or it's not too overbearing. They're unprecedented times. Let's take an abundance of caution here, and follow those edicts and follow those orders. And now we're 2 years down the road, and my kids yesterday, Friday, was their last day wearing masks at school for now. Now I keep telling my kids, be prepared, because it is going to come back at some point. And we'll have that discussion when we get there. But we're just now getting out of it. We're just now getting to the point where the government's willing to relinquish a little bit of that control back. And the church has been silent. The church has been like, yeah, okay, whatever. We can't do anything about it. Big deal. No big deal. It's not that big of an ask, but it is, because it distorts reality. It propagates fear. And we live in delusion, and we're all victims of that. We're all victims of this misinformation, of believing the biases that we already are predisposed to. But in those circumstances, we have to come back to an absolute truth, which is God's word. And we didn't do that well. We didn't come back to the absolute truths well.
So I can briefly summarize what you said there, because I think it's important. We were uncertain about things, which, maybe you could make a case that it's understandable why we were uncertain about things. There were multiple sides, it's scientific, etc. Okay. But in the uncertainty, we also extended uncertainty to things that are very clearly scriptural mandates. Things like gathering together, singing, preaching the word, administering communion, right? There were churches that wouldn't do that because of, and I just want to be honest, I was part of a church overseas where the government lockdowns were very strong. And as I was going through these, my positions now, I've arrived at them because largely the church that I was with then, we didn't stand up like I would have liked to. Like I wasn't prepared for some of these things. And so the criticism that we are leveling at the church in America, I was in church leadership, and we did not do a good job with some of these things. And I've had to since then really reevaluate priorities. But what you're saying, Bradley, is in uncertainty, we extended that uncertainty to things which ought not to have been uncertain. They're clear biblical mandates. Love one another, gather together, administer the ordinances, sing, grieve with one another, that sort of thing. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, and live in full abundance of joy, in the comfort and knowledge. COVID is no different. COVID presented nothing different than the reality that we already know, which is that this life is full of suffering and full of pain, and eventually will end in death. COVID didn't change any of that. It just created a bigger monster out of it than, like, a more sudden monster out of it. But it didn't change the reality of what we know to be true. And we treated it like we could put the monster back in the closet type of a thing.
Yeah, one other thing that we were talking about, and this is kind of getting into the what should the church have done, and we've kind of mixed that in with our answers of what the church did to this point. But you were talking about the idea that the church did not push back on the effect that COVID and the government suggestions and the media insistences of how COVID should be handled, the church didn't even seemingly consider the effect that those ideas and directives and mandates would have on other areas of life. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you can find the numbers for yourself about mental health cases going up. There's studies now coming out about children's speech impediments because the lack of facial recognition that they have, and the learning process that is young kids seeing faces and mimicking that, the love that we displayed through our face. And so all of these things led to grave social issues down the road, not even down the road, but like alternative impacts. You mentioned the businesses earlier, the economic impact that was, and then even just like the fact that we weren't even calculating into it the fact that it was right at the beginning of a very crucial election year. Like this hit us right as we got into the full-fledged of presidential election in the United States, with a very polarizing president, incumbent president. And we weren't even factoring that in, or maybe we did, but we didn't really care enough about him because he was Trump, and we don't really want to fully endorse him. So we didn't even factor that in, or at least let it be vocal about the fact that it was factoring in. I don't know. So there was a lot of things down the line that we just didn't even. It was all about health and safety, in the very physical sense of it.
Yeah, and it was discouraging that as it wore on, there was a seeming blindness to the fact that this is having massive cultural impacts. People are not doing well. And yet, love your neighbor. The loving thing to do is to stay away, right? Now, I have two anecdotal stories, and take them for what they're worth. I think that anecdotal evidence is a good tool to use, not as long as it's not the only tool that you use. But
the plural of anecdote. This is not my line. I heard this somewhere. The plural of anecdote is data.
Yes,
so
that's true.
Anecdotal is small case, but when you put enough anecdotal evidence together, you get data.
Yeah, that's a good point. So here's my two data points. I'll say it that way. We're in Texas now, which is supposedly a very conservative state as far as states go. And my daughter and her friend, we live in a development here. So there's lots of families that are kind of in this development, lots of houses. And so they've decided to start a babysitting gig. So they put up some posters on mailboxes in public places like the park and things like that, and just offering their services to babysit, which is great. They're learning how to do this. My daughter's done this some in the past and making some money, being responsible. Fantastic. I wholly support it. They've had a number of replies and requests for them to work, but two of them are just heartbreaking. One of them was a girl. My daughter's only 13. And there was a 12-year-old girl that replied. And basically the long and the short of it was she is so isolated and so lonely that she was willing to pay them to basically come over and be friends with her because she's been so isolated from all of this COVID stuff. A second one was a younger girl, a 4-year-old girl, and I and my daughter and her friend, we met with this young girl's mom and grandmother. And the grandmother grandmother was explaining that it wouldn't be babysitting in the truest sense because the mom or the grandmother would almost certainly be around just doing things in other rooms. The problem that this family has is that their 4-year-old girl has not played with other children. She didn't say not very much. She basically said she has not played with other children because of the pandemic. And so we think we need someone to just come over and play with her because she has no experience doing this. Like, that is an incredible and damaging and saddening set of stories there. Just from a babysitting poster that my daughter put up. And yet we as a church, we have failed to realize that there are many, many tangential relationships or issues related to the government and the media's insistence that we fix it all with a one size, don't think about anything else policy.
Yep. Well, it was a bit of a snowball narrative too. Like, the more they played it up, the worse they had to make it look, and that became the only thing we could talk about. It just it snowballed out of control, and all of that. I don't know that there's anything the church could have done to rightly stop the COVID machine, but there's a lot the church could have done to speak truth in the chaos, in the momentum of it. So I don't know. We didn't talk about this, but I don't know if the church really could have had enough of a voice to stop it, but they certainly could have been a voice of reason through it, to where those kind of stories could have been minimized and could have been limited through the church speaking some clarity and some truth into it. Because you still see churches, our church has gone maskless for quite a while now to their against the state edict, but you still see members of our church wearing masks, and at some point you have to wonder, do we need to start confronting those wearing masks, saying, hey, I think you're thinking wrongly about this now, and the evidence has bared this out. I'm fine with you wearing the mask, but I just want to make sure that you're not driven by a narrative that just isn't right or isn't biblically grounded. And that probably transitions us into what the church should do now about the pandemic, what we should do now moving forward. And I think you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. So our third question, if you're keeping track, is what do we do now? I think that it's an interesting time. You said earlier, we're all COVID weary. And yet there are lessons that the church needs to learn from COVID and from the pandemic that if we do not learn, we will perpetually be at the behest and the tool of the government. And we won't even notice it the more it happens. And so we have to learn some lessons. We have to think about what we can do now with the pandemic and moving forward, because we have Ukraine, right? Are we just following into the same kinds of traps, doing whatever the government tells us to do and the media is telling us to do without thought, without discernment? Are we quick to make judgments? Are we slow to think? Those are violations of biblical principles. And so what do we need to do now? Well, one is we don't need to forget it. The irony is, we've been trying to move on from the pandemic for so long, and yet as world events have turned quickly and sharply, COVID has basically disappeared. And I just want to say for a moment, church, don't forget, pause and reflect. Are you happy with how you handled the pandemic, and specifically what the government told you to do and what the media told you to do because of the pandemic? Don't move on until you've had some introspection. And I'm going to add this to it. Don't move on until you've had some conversations with members of your church who saw it differently than you about, okay, how did we handle it, right? Like, Bradley and I are a bit critical, not some of our own church, but definitely of the church at large in the United States. But it doesn't have to be only criticism, right? Like, Christianity is a religion of grace, and so there needs to be some introspection. I think the church wasn't ready. I think we had bad theology on Romans 13, on the role of government, on the role of what the church is supposed to engage in. Is COVID just a political issue? These sorts of things. But we have a chance to not move on yet, but to have some introspection, to not forget it. That's one thing I would say.
Yeah, and along that, every Sunday we take communion, and one of the primary directives they give us as to whether we should take communion or not is, are you at peace with the church body, or do you have relationships that are in tension, right? Or do you have did you say something that you said out of haste or out of anger or out of frustration that isn't resolved, that isn't, and those are appropriate times where we shouldn't be participating in communion. And that comes down to a spirit of humility, accountability, willingness to admit that you're wrong, that you didn't handle it graciously. You may have had a point, like you can say something that might be true in an ungracious manner, and you're still at fault. And for me, until a lot of churches, and I would include mine in this, until they come around to some form of a thoughtful reflection openly in front of the congregation. Here's lessons we learned. Here's where we went right. Here's where we went wrong. Here's where we might need to ask for forgiveness in some areas. And then here's what we learn, because ultimately, we are called to grace and forgiveness, but that comes with you forgive the broken, you forgive the truly repentant. An apology is only an apology if you're willing to change, and like you're saying, we're slowly, but not slowly, we're quickly transitioning out of COVID into just life as it was, or the next crisis in Ukraine. And I think it's very important for the church to take some steps of accountability in this and lead in that. Really, I mean, the whole society needs to be held accountable to some degree, from top down, and we all need to reflect on that. But the church should be leaders in that.
Yeah, you said it well. I just want to echo it a little bit and add one thing, is that I think that there was a large push, and there were several articles written, one in Christianity Today by Ed Stetzer, and one in the Gospel Coalition Canada by Joe Carter. Early, I'm talking like spring and summer of 2020, that talked about conspiracy theories and slander among Christians. And what the articles said, especially the one in the Gospel Coalition by Joe Carter, was that any Christian who engages in spreading information that is conspiracy theory is engaging in the sin of slander, that this sin of slander is demonic in nature, and that those Christians need to be excommunicated from their local church immediately, and that any Christians who are unwilling to confront them are also in sin. Now, the rub is his definition of conspiracy theory, which in his Christian framework became rephrased as slander. His definition of conspiracy theory was anything that was not supported by reputable sources at the time. The Christianity Today article was very, very similar. And yet, now we know that many of those conspiracy theories around COVID have turned out to be true, or at least extremely plausible. Lab leak theory, right? Side effects, all of these things, many other things. At the time, those were literally, according to the article, demonic and worthy of church discipline and being excommunicated from the church. Now, I think one thing that churches now need to do, I'm sure that church leaders read these articles or were influenced by people who read these articles. And I think there was a very quick tendency to dismiss any legitimate concern that any church congregation member had as fringe or alt-right or, whatever. And I know that there's a lot of hurt from members in churches who feel like their pastors basically wrote them off as insubordinate, as slanderers, as malicious, as people who were stirring the pot, as people who were simply selfish and not wanting to wear masks. Church leaders not considering that there may have been some very valid biblical reasons why their members were resisting things like masks and social distancing or social separation, online church, vaccine mandates, things like this. Very valid biblical reasons were just written off as, oh, you're just fringe, right? And I think one thing the church needs to do now is address some of those members and issues that really that really were set aside and kind of hastily judged.
Yeah, that's well said. The trouble, and this goes back to the trouble with singular narrative that, like we talked about, the loving thing is to wear the mask, is those who stand out against it or push back on it. It is then their heart that is in question. It is their motives. It is their intention. They're not living by the spirit of the age Christianity. And so it is them who get demonized, like you're saying. It's them who get challenged and say, you're not loving, or you're not being loving enough, or this is a small ask and you're being stubborn, or you're being proud, or you're it's the danger of having that singular definition of what love is. And I felt this strongly personally. There is aspects of pride in my response, certainly. But that doesn't diminish the fact that there was aspects of pride on the other side. And and then when things sort of flipped for us in our church, it became, well, don't disparage people with different points of view from you. Now that we've changed, we want to live in unity. And I look at it and I go, where was the unity call when I was the one speaking out? A small example. And again, I love my church, but a small example is we make accommodations now, and have since we took the masks off, for those who want to wear masks. We have a section set aside for them in the congregation. For those more concerned, we have a whole specific room set aside for them. We allow for them to wear masks if they want to wear masks. But when we were in the thick of it, there was no such accommodations made for those of us questioning the validity of any of it. There was no,
or who had a real conscience issue with it.
Who had a real conscious issue about it. There was no considerations made. There was no call for unity. It was a you will wear a mask, or we will ask you to leave the church. And that was a short window of time that they were that stringent about it. But it was still a moment of time that made it very clear dissent won't be tolerated. And that I think is what we're getting to. Just a heart of acknowledgement that everything wasn't handled perfectly, and I didn't handle everything perfectly either. And I'm willing to make those, willing and ready to make those concessions. But it has to a certain degree be a two-way street on that front, and that dialogue has to be approached with an honest conversation.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say, because we're coming down pretty hard on this sort of thing, but I have to come down with one more statement, and that is this. Recently, I read, or I kind of came to an understanding of a definition of the word statism. Statism is the idea that the state is God. Well, what does that mean? One way to understand statism is if we say statism is when we allow the state or the government to define what is good and evil. And so I would extend that. Statism is when the church allows the government to define the core Christian value and God part of God's character of the definition of love. And I think Christians and churches and church leaders who allowed the world and the government and the media to condense their understanding of love into these pithy little statements, they are guilty of statism, of allowing the state or the media to define good and evil rather than going with God's definition of good and evil, in this case of loving your neighbor, which is found expressed in the Ten Commandments. And so if we're guilty of that statism, that is guilty of idolatry. And people in churches and church leaders who allow that to happen, they need to repent before God. And they need to repent before their churches. That's a serious thing, to allow some other entity other than God and other than the Bible to define, in this case, what is the greatest good, love for God, and the second greatest good, love for your neighbor.
No, that's really good stuff. As we close out here, I do have a final question that we haven't talked about directly, but I think it's important. So let's try and keep it to 2 minutes, which is really 5 minutes. But as Christians, because I also need to change the way I handle things moving forward, and I have a lot of critique for the way the church handled it. So my question is, someone in my position, I would appreciate and almost expect an apology to some wrongdoing, to some mishandling of. I think it's important for the church to acknowledge that they didn't handle it the right way, because nobody did. But what about those of us who are skeptical that they're going to get that apology? They're skeptical they're going to get that response. Believe that we're just going to move right into the Ukraine crisis and basically put COVID aside. Is it incumbent on someone like myself and those of us sympathetic to the discussion? I mean, if you're still here after an hour and 10 minutes, then you're obviously sympathetic to what we're talking about. Is it incumbent on us to call out the leadership in private? Obviously, I mean, start with the biblical response of, come to them at first, one, and then many, then several, and then the church. Is it a responsibility of mine? I'll make it specific, to bring it up to the leadership that they have been wrong on this and they should repent to a degree. I mean, apologize. That's what we're asking. Is it incumbent? Is that something that we need to learn as Christians? Something that we need to be holding people to account for that? Or should we just expect the church to do it, and if they don't, move on in grace and unity?
In 1 Peter, it says that love covers a multitude of sins. And so my policy with this, as a general life policy, is if an offense has been committed, and me, in the love that God gives me for that other person, can simply let it go and forgive them and continue to live in unity, then that's my first step. Okay? So I think a lot of offenses can be covered over by the love that's given to us by God. However, there's a danger, because sometimes when we try and do that, we cover something up rather than having it covered over by love. And covering it up only breeds bitterness and frustration, which then grows, and you look with suspicion on every other thing that person does. And in that case, my policy is, if love cannot legitimately cover it up, or not cover it up, cover it over, then I have to talk to the person. Right? I have to talk to the person. So my concern would be, I feel it in myself. I want, some of the stuff that's now being admitted, I was saying a year ago, and there's this pride in me that says, I want that person to admit that I was right. That's not the motivation why you would want to talk to a church or church leaders, right? But if you have a genuine bitterness or hurt that love is not covering over, then I think that as a brother or sister in Christ, you have an obligation to go and speak to that leader, that church leadership team, elders, or whatever it is. However, there's another side of this, and that is some of these things are significant, fundamental issues. How we view the government, the role of the church, right? And so I think that there is a sense where churches have to learn some lessons that are beyond just the individual, I felt really criticized wrongly by my church leaders. And so I think there's a separate role for really wanting your church to be healthy, your church leaders to understand better what it means to be in the world, but to have Christ as Lord. And there's a second sense that there are bigger issues than just the hurt between you and church leaders or a pastor that you have to deal with. And that is the health of your church and the church in America overall in dealing with how do we deal with a media that we can't trust, government institutions that lie to us constantly about the nature of gender and sexuality and theft and crime and all of these things. Like we need to be more discerning, and we need to have a better framework for interacting with government in this way. And so there's a sense where, yeah, I do think we have an obligation to bring up some of those issues, not for restoration of relationship necessarily, but for the health of the church and for the discernment, the ability of the church to carry out its role. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, not for personal gratification if I was right. And I think that starts with if we are to approach church leadership in this, it's not in making accusations right off the bat. I think it starts with the heart of desiring understanding, and because there are things that I simply don't know how they approached it, or the how they came to the conclusions that they came to. So really trying to get to the heart of that before saying you hurt me or you did this wrong. Repent. It's not that. It's hey, can we think about, how we handled this, and how did you guys see this, and do you guys see do you see it differently now? But a heart of love, a heart of humility too, not, like you said, not trying to be just right for the sake of being right, but also with a conviction saying, I know the way I felt about this, and I know that it hurt me and others, and I want to try and get to the bottom of why that came about. So I think that's good stuff. Any final thoughts?
My only final thought, we've kind of already mentioned, is I feel like in a lot of ways COVID was a gracious thing to the church, because if we're paying attention, we will see that we made some mistakes, that we had some deficient theology, that we were cowardly. I was cowardly. I'll just admit that, especially earlier on. Yeah, whatever the government says, I'm not going to ruffle feathers. I'm not going to make a stink about anything, right? I think if we can admit that we made mistakes, that we sinned against people, that we were cowards, that we had deficient theology in some of these areas, this could actually be a tool, because I think society is getting to the point, and the government is getting to the point where it's putting more and more pressure on Christians. And so this could have been God's grace in allowing us to clarify positions and resolve and take stands of courage. And my hope going forward would be that we can learn from this and how we responded to it, and become salt and light where we failed to have that salt and light. There's damage maybe done, right, to the reputation of the church as a bastion of truth. Nevertheless, we proceed, we move forward, and we try and grow in our resolve and character and conviction in these areas.
Yeah. We're going to make mistakes. The church leadership is going to make mistakes, no matter which direction. But whatever the demeanor and the disposition of leadership is, trickles down further. Boldness begets boldness. Cowardice begets cowardice. And so when we are bold in our handling of things like COVID, in our conviction to God's authoritative word and discernment that we see the world through, the discernment we get by seeing the world through God's word. When we're bold in that, then we are bold in other areas of our life. And when our leaders are bold in that, our congregation is bold. When we are cowardice in that, we model cowardice to our those around us, to our church members, to our those weaker in the faith. And I think that's really where, like you said, that the COVID was kind of gracious toward the church and just kind of exposing some of that. And we're in a time that we need boldness. We need bold leadership. It is not a time for cowardice. It is a time to feel real persecution. When I was talking with Cameron, our brother-in-law, today, and it is easy for us to feel comfortable because we're not willing to invite persecution. What I'm trying to drive at is that persecution is almost a decision. We can choose to be cowardice and live in comfort and not face persecution, but still have, our belief that whatever the issue is, transgender is an easy one right now. We're not going to fight that battle, and we're not going to face persecution. Or we can choose to be bold in those areas. And when we're bold, that's when the persecution is going to come, and that's when the trials are going to come. And we need bold leadership. We need bold leadership. And I don't want persecution, but we know that they hated Christ, and they'll hate his followers. And that comes with the boldness that Christ had, that I think our leaders and ourselves. I want to be part of that, leading from the front, in boldness. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, the righteous man is bold like a lion, roars like a lion, it says. And we need to grow in that for sure. I know I do too. So,
yeah.
All right, good talk. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for joining us. And we will see you next time.
Sounds good.